Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jessica Meyerson, and I'm one of three executive co-directors at Educopia Institute. Hello, Nathan. I see so many friendly faces in here. It's just hi. So my vertical at Educopia is fiscal sponsorship and organizational development. And I'm going to be serving as your moderator for today's panel discussion. So you're in the right place if you came to learn more about MetaArchive across its life cycle, change and resilience in the digital preservation ecosystem. A little bit about Educopia. Educopia connects diverse knowledge communities with resources, power, and each other. And we do this through a combination of applied research, consulting, and fiscal sponsorship. Educopia was founded in 2006, so we're coming up on 20 years, about 2 years behind MetaArchive. The cooperative, which was established in 2004, was a major inspiration for Educopia's formation. And Martin Halbert, one of Educopia's co-founders, as well as MetaArchive's co-founders, is in the room as we speak.
And the LOX founders.
Thank you so much. We were just talking, Vicky and David queued us up so beautifully to describe one of LOX's many instantiations. So the cooperative established in 2004 was a major inspiration for Educopia's formation, a nonprofit organization that would focus its attention on facilitating interinstitutional collaboration to uncover opportunities and address challenges at the systems level. I'm both humbled and grateful to have played a consultative and facilitative role in MetaArchive's transition period from 2023 till now, and look forward with grounded hopefulness at the work of its former members who will continue in new PLN formations, so still in the LOX ecosystem, which are mostly but not all regional place-based PLNs. We want to take a brief moment just to acknowledge, however, the grief, the disorientation, and the pressure felt by everyone in the room in this moment in response to the unprecedented attacks on equity, justice, free speech, research, and education, and also recognize the clarity that the moment provides about what must be defended. So, myself and your panelists here today would like to be explicit about the desired takeaways that we hope to convey to our CNI attendees. Amongst all of you, we see library deans, assistant deans, chief technology officers, consortial project and program leads, resource allocators, institutional and field level change makers. And we hope that a few of the items you take away from today's panel include the recognition that we need community-based digital preservation now more than ever, that MetaArchive's deliberate sunset is not a reflection on the viability of distributed community-governed digital preservation networks writ large, quite the contrary. We know enough now, 20 years into LOX-based digital preservation, to design for community resilience, similar to the way that the technology itself has been designed. And we want to offer a provocation as to whether it's an inherent tension or a false binary around balancing affordability of a community-owned digital preservation network with adequate resourcing to ensure that the network, as a digital preservation solution, is actually usable for institutions whose staff capacity varies wildly. Information institutions and knowledge organizations are being presented with a vision of a future rooted in fear, suppression, and extreme economic disparity. Even for those it appears to serve, it offers little more than control and fear. But there are other visions rooted in courage, imagination, equity, ones that prioritize care and shared thriving. Many of the conversations and presentations shared at this CNI reflect those roots. Before discussing MetaArchive and its journey through community lifecycle stages, we believe it's also helpful to frame the discussion within the politics of abundance and scarcity. Many may recognize these terms from Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's recent book, Abundance, which posits that scarcity is the result of deliberate policy decisions. They emphasize building more of the stuff that we need, such as affordable housing, so scaling up production. And they argue that it's institutional risk aversion and inefficiency that are making it difficult to build the things we need. The book is sort of a combination between a techno-optimistic vision and it aligns itself also with policy realism. With good policy, while good policy is absolutely a critical lever for systemic change, how do we advance visions of abundance without relying solely or primarily on markets, the state, and key moments of national mobilization? There's a long and deep lineage of educational visionaries and leaders whose strategies for creating an equitable education system still involve infrastructure and policy, of course, but also emphasize mutual aid, liberatory imagination, and embodied commitments to our espoused values. Some of these thinkers include Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimbard of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, who has extensively researched cooperative economics and community-based economic development, and demonstrated how similar principles can be applied within higher education institutions to foster collaboration. Dr. Tyrone C. Howard, professor of education at UCLA School of Education and Information Studies, faculty director of the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools, advocates for collaborative efforts among educational institutions to address systemic inequities and highlights collective strategies that are not solely dependent on external funding sources. Dr. Kathleen Fitzpatrick, professor of English at Michigan State University, argues that mutual aid is not just an emergency response mechanism, but a fundamental orientation that shifts culture in higher ed away from institutional competition and prestige-driven behavior and shifts higher ed back towards its public service mission. And finally, Dr. Marissa Duarte, associate professor at the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University, examines how Native nations develop and sustain their own communication infrastructures as an act of self-determination. To be clear, advocating for academy and library-owned infrastructure is not equivalent to creating infrastructure to achieve indigenous self-determination. However, Dr. Duarte's work demonstrates that it is possible to create technological and social infrastructures for cultural stewardship that do not rely on top-down resourcing. June Jordan was an essayist, poet, teacher, and activist who advocated for immigration, gender, race, and representation. Many of you will have read or come across this quote at some point in time. This is a June Jordan quote. "We are the ones we've been waiting for." It is a reminder that we have tools at our disposal to take action and change our current conditions. I've taken time to frame the discussion this way in order to emphasize that we must use every strategy, every tack, at every scale, and that means holding ourselves accountable for exercising power and agency in big and small ways. And this brings us to the work of MetaArchive, a 20-year-old community-driven digital preservation network. Its history reveals how politics of abundance and scarcity have shaped our field and what it looks like to organize for long-term values-based resilience. In its beginnings, its formation from 2004 to 2006, MetaArchive emerged as a response to the scarcity of sustainable digital preservation infrastructure, bringing together institutions to collectively invest in open source solutions like locks. This collective approach demonstrated an early commitment to abundance, resource sharing, collaboration, decentralization, as opposed to isolated proprietary solutions. From 2007 to 2010, what Educopia calls its validation period, it recognized the risks of institutional dependence. MetaArchive transitioned from Emory University to Educopia Institute to ensure longevity beyond shifting funding priorities. In 2011, MetaArchive shifted from its reliance on INDIP funding to a membership-funded model. These moves reflected an abundance mindset, investing in shared governance and community-driven sustainability rather than relying on a single institution's resources. In its acceleration period from 2011 to 2018, digital preservation was becoming institutionalized. Leadership was within MetaArchive shifted from high-level administrators to preservation specialists, a growing field. This professionalization marked progress within cultural stewardship and created a growing need for affordable digital preservation solutions. The period of expansion in programmatic digital preservation also introduced some scarcity challenges, budget constraints, barriers for smaller institutions. So in 2016, or from 2016 to 2018, MetaArchive pursued the Supernode pilot project, aimed to counteract this scarcity by lowering technical barriers and expanding access to preservation services for under-resourced organizations. And finally, in its transition period, what we term to be or sort of contain to be 2019 to present day, facing increasing diversity in institutional needs and funding models, MetaArchive continued investing in community-driven abundance. Project Mycelium, which was undertaken in 2022, and the Community Research Task Force have focused on redistributing technical expertise, refining business models, and ensuring equitable participation. By prioritizing collaboration over competition and shared infrastructure over exclusivity, MetaArchive embodies abundance-oriented strategies in digital preservation. The decision to sunset, which came in April of 2024, came not from the realization that abundance-oriented strategies fail, but from the community's own organizational stewardship policies, developed to ensure that if faced with an existential threat or threats, that there would be resources to ensure a deliberate, careful sunsetting process, which included explicitly dedicated efforts to compost resources from MetaArchive's history to nourish the growth of existing and new PLNs. MetaArchive's journey highlights how digital preservation, like all infrastructure, is shaped by broader socio-political forces. As we discuss the future of research and cultural stewardship infrastructure, we must continue asking, how do we sustain abundance amongst ourselves? How do we resist scarcity narratives that limit access and innovation? And how do we ensure that digital preservation remains a shared, equitable endeavor? And with that, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce our panelists who will be exploring these and other questions in today's discussion. Myself and all of our panelists were members of the Transformation Research Team, what we might refer to later as the TRT, a group made up of representatives from MetaArchive Leadership, Educopia, and LOCKSS, to hold the whole through the sunsetting process from April 2024 to March 2025. So I would like to introduce Jackson Huang, Research Lead and Consultant at Educopia, former Community Facilitator for MetaArchive, Snowden Becker, LOCKSS Program Community Manager at Stanford University, Zach Vowell, Digital Archivist and Digital Strategies Coordinator at California Polytechnic State University, and Alex Kinnaman, Assistant Director for Digital Libraries and Preservation at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. And with that, we go to our first question. So this is for Alex and Snowden, who will answer sort of different facets of the larger question on how can digital preservation be reframed as an investment in abundance rather than a cost to minimize. So starting with you, Alex, what lessons from MetaArchive's model challenge the scarcity mindset often governing institutional budget decisions? And how do private LOCKSS networks represent an opportunity to build community-owned infrastructure rather than rely on commercialized, scarcity-driven alternatives?
So Virginia Tech, as Jess just mentioned, was a founding member of MetaArchive, and we joined and we stayed for two primary reasons. One being the unique technical infrastructure, and the other being the very strong community component. Ongoing participation and engagement with digital preservation communities has only benefited us, mostly through knowledge sharing and group problem solving and identifying and responding to trends. Having strong engagement in preservation has supported us in attracting talent, creating better digital library infrastructure, and hitting those words that admin really like efficient, safe, compliant. And, there are some financial risks. When you invest in something as big as digital preservation, it's hard to get away from that. And there could be some legal risks, PII, always a big issue in DigiPres. But there is also a mission risk. The Virginia Tech Library mission is provide and promote access to information resources for the achievement of the university's objectives in learning, discovery, and engagement. Basically, these things become valuable later and over time when they want to use them. But if we don't invest in keeping them safe, that creates some challenges. One of our strategies has been to frame sustainability and digital preservation as cost-effective. Digital preservation creates value over time because it ensures that what we're creating now is actually accessible later. Being proactive about loss prevention is our responsibility as a library, and the cost to recover data, which we have experienced more than once, is far more than the maintenance and management of that material. The community, composed of our colleagues and peer institutions, are the resources we use to develop well-informed decisions, as well as building networks and pursuing research. The community's solutions ensure compliance for grant funding agencies, research initiatives. And ideally, digital preservation should be a part of the base knowledge of my colleagues, within the library, beyond just me. It's a group effort, and we all take that perspective to their roles on projects and conversations with stakeholders. So not just on storage or backups or some one activity that we did, but as a whole set of managed and ongoing activities. And I think that we're actually moving in that direction at Virginia Tech. As preservation is more of a shared effort, it contrasts to the unique collections that distinguish our organizations from another, but brings us together because our needs and requirements are very much the same. And that's why MetaArchive was built, because we have more in common in our preservation infrastructure and activities than we do in the collections, but we still need somewhere to put our unique special collections and ETDs, which was what we originally put in MetaArchive. And a lot of comments we get from faculty at Virginia Tech are, oh yeah, the library takes care of that, which is a little scary because sometimes maybe we're not quite there, but we want to live up to that. And the collaborative information sharing is one way that we get there. And I didn't do this on purpose, Nathan. You're here, though. And a shout out to AP Trust. We often talk about sharing the responsibility of risk together. We're all engaging in trusting one another with our materials. This is especially true for PLNs. We are literally entrusting other institutions with our content. And these communities are the intervention for rebuilding trust amongst our peers, trust with the public, and demonstrate the necessity of community-based models overall so that we can continue creating these environments. And sunsets are natural, and then rebuilding is also natural. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, and we're going to move it over to Snowden. So Snowden, your take on this larger question, instead of thinking about how cheaply we can get it done, how can our necessary expenditure on preservation of digital assets become an investment in staff, in community, and in relationship building?
I think this is such an important question for everybody to contemplate as budgets shrink, as our traditional sources of income and support are imperiled. And yet we still have to do the necessary work of digital preservation. And the metaphor that occurred to me last night as I was thinking about this is renting versus owning. You know, when you are part of a LOX network, you own your mechanisms, you know where your data lives. You are also cultivating the ability of your staff to learn and do, as opposed to just pick a product and write a check. Set it and forget it is not a great match for the active process of digital preservation. But it is a great fit for companies that really capitalize on you forgetting how much you have in there, or just keep putting stuff in and we'll keep charging you. And maybe you forget you have Hulu and Paramount Plus and whatever. Those models are not necessarily compatible. But one of the things that came up in our conversations with MetaArchive members were things like we really appreciated the opportunity that this represented for us to be part of a digital preservation community that we would not have had the ability to participate in at this level otherwise. You know, we're not one of the big institutions in our state. We don't have a ton of resources, but with MetaArchive, we got support. And so this word equity is being used in a lot of ways. But again, that rent versus own model, when you own, you build equity, you build staff talent and capacity, and you insource with a community-based solution, and you create an opportunity to cultivate talent, to recruit talent, and to put that talent to work elsewhere in your institution, because there's always other stuff to do that once you know how to do, as opposed to just buy or rent from somebody else, you get value. So it's money you have to spend anyway. So why not spend it in a way where you invest and build equity?
Thank you so much, Snowden. And that transitions us to our next question. What does it actually take to sustain community-driven infrastructure, and what happens when institutions fail to invest in it? And so for this question, we'll start with Jackson. Looking at MetaArchive's life cycle, what were the key tensions or some of the key tensions between institutional resource allocation strategies and the cooperative model?
Thank you, Jessica. So as Jessica kind of mentioned earlier, MetaArchive started originally as a grant-funded project with both grant funding and, in terms of composition, having more larger institutions that were able to contribute sweat equity to provide not only funding but staffing to really get the project off the ground. And then after some time, recognizing the abundance that there was in the community, switched to a membership model. updates to the membership model address certain equity needs, like having lower costs to ensure that a wide range of institution types could participate, including the negotiation of ad hoc discounts so that members could continue to participate. But in some ways, it also failed to adequately address MetaArchive's real resourcing needs, which in turn contributed to some long-term degradation of the function of the network. MetaArchive's financial and overall organizational health would have really benefited from more accurate and proactive assessment of MetaArchive's staffing needs, what is necessary to run a sustainable and thriving network, and not just the bare bones to keep the lights on, something that can be really challenging to do in a collective model because whose job is it to make that assessment? And realistic and concrete revenue targets along with assessment of whether we were meeting them to know when to shift a revenue strategy or find alternative solutions to resourcing the network or to shift the service model. So I think when you're starting up a new project, it can be really difficult to know exactly how much resourcing you actually need to make it work. And when the network started and under its grant period, there was one full-time FTE, and then which was decreased to 0.5 FTE during the membership period. And in kind of these different efforts to address some of the pain points Jessica had mentioned, during the Community Research Task Force work around the technical debt, one of the solutions that they proposed was having a full-time community facilitator and a full-time technical lead. So not just one staff person, but actually kind of two people to address both tending to the community, but also understanding that kind of maintaining the technical product was related, but not exactly the same activity. And I definitely feel like having come in to MetaArchive a bit later into this process, that having had those two full-time staff people at an earlier time would have really made a huge amount of difference, both in terms of, addressing technical debt, but also more active support of member usage, active recruitment of a wider range of member types, and just making sure that everyone's needs were actually being met through the platform over time. And I really want to emphasize this kind of importance of not just adequate staffing, but what that staffing looks like, because as any long-term network or any long-term technical solution has, there are technical issues that kind of arise over time, right? You get technical debt. And I think that in terms of thinking about some of the proposed solutions, there's also sometimes a belief that you can get a developer to fix that problem. And developers are great. I love developers. I love working with them. But having a technical product manager or someone to actually systemically identify those problems and propose sustainable solutions is also a different need. So that was something that, towards the end of the period in working with MetaArchive and also looking at what the community was kind of proposing as solutions, it was really understanding that it's not just how many hours do you need, but it's like what kind of hours do you need. You need the development, but you also need kind of someone who's understanding the technical roadmap in the longer term. Aside from thinking about the staffing of the network itself, one of the things that has become really apparent through MetaArchive is the importance of investment of local staff time. So the labor for community infrastructure can't really be outsourced the way that using a vendor solution can, right? You need to make sure that the network is adequately staffed, but you actually also need to make sure that you're reserving a certain amount of your staff time to participate in the network as well, because it's distributed infrastructure. If you're going to have people run storage caches at each institution, that needs to be really written into somebody's job description to make sure that, you're not just paying into it, but you're actually actively maintaining that network as well. I think, as Jessica said, in that kind of switch from that startup phase to the more operational aspect of digital preservation, sometimes that can get a little bit lost in that conversation. So really emphasizing that participating in the community model is not just paying into it, but it's not just paying money into it. It's really investing, as Snowden said, the resources, the time resources, and which you're getting a return back on, but you need to make sure that you are correctly allocating for. I think also in terms of value, that it's really important to think about membership costs, not only as, comparing how much does this service cost compared to another service, but really thinking about the relative value that cost as an investment brings to the organization. If those membership fees are paying for mission critical infrastructure, both the technical infrastructure itself, but also building staff skills and competencies, which is really critical to the success of the organization, it's important to remember that while cutting a small annual membership fee in the short term may address budget shortfalls, in the long term that can really imperil the overall mission success of the organization. And I think the last thing is a kind of unglamorous but really important thing that we realized running community infrastructure is that the kind of business acumen, or at least awareness, to think about revenue targets and assessment about whether or not you're meeting them is actually really important. Because I think for MetaArchive, we would have really benefited from having some more targeted and proactive marketing for prospective members and making connections with them. Because we hear from members over and over again that being able to participate was really valuable. But, if you're less connected to other digital preservationists in general, you work at a small institution, you're also less likely to know about something like MetaArchive, right? And so that's something where when we think about revenue targets, it's not just like more money good, it's also thinking about like how do you proactively connect with your market, I think in a way that vendors are sometimes more successful than we are as, librarians who have a different skill set, which is, again, totally understandable. But something that's really important if we're thinking about community infrastructure more holistically.
Thanks so much, Jackson. So, Zach, to you, what are the risks of short-term convenience choices, such as outsourcing, when institutions should be thinking intergenerationally or digital preservation as an intergenerational project?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty well known that making the case for the demand of digital preservation and articulating its value can be it's pretty tricky to do. There's a lot of issues there. And I think one risk for moving away from a community-based preservation solution is that outreach and articulation of value for digital preservation among all the stakeholders involved, there's a risk of that becoming an afterthought or an inconvenience or just something that you don't want to do. Whereas with the community-based solution, it's very much at the forefront of everybody's minds. Another risk, I think, is that decision-making about the preservation infrastructure that's being used can become not transparent anymore. Along with any of the digital preservation operations that may be a part of the solution. So one anecdotal experience that I can relate from being in MetaArchive was a few years ago, the cooperative decided to review the number of replications that were being used across the network. So anytime you put something into the cache or into the network, it would be replicated across 7 caches initially. And we went through a very deliberative decision-making process that involved input from all of the members, first reviewing the number of replications and then making a decision about reducing those. And I think that just made everybody feel, that they were a part of the decision-making process and, that basically it was their decision. Another example is Project Mycelium that Jessica had mentioned. This was an opportunity for the cooperative to do some experimentation and investigation in essentially what was the digital preservation software. As much as we love logs, and we do love logs, we thought that it might be worthwhile to review the requirements. What do we want from the software, and then actually try and prototype a new software and a new system. And then one of the things that we got to do with that is share it with the broader digital preservation community. Share what the requirements were that we developed, and just tell about our experience too. And I think that was really valuable. And then just another risk that I see just from within my own institution is that a lot of times short-term convenience, in this instance, with if we're talking about considering a market-based digital preservation solution, a lot of times that short-term convenience can evolve into long-term inertia, where stakeholder expectations and assumptions kind of get embedded. And then there's kind of an ongoing convenience of just renewing a contract versus, making a change and the perceived pain that might involve. And then finally, I would say long-term budget planning is also pretty difficult, or can become difficult. That it would be another risk. When you think about, inflation and potential consolidation in the market for digital preservation solutions, it can be difficult to plan for those things.
Thank you both. That transitions us to our next question, which is, give us some information about how can institutions invest in long-term capacity building for digital preservation? So there's the system itself, through membership fees, et cetera. But what about the readiness? Snowden spoke to this earlier. Jackson spoke to this a little bit, which is just what kinds of capacity and skill building do we need to be doing for long-term digital preservation to be successful? So Alex, we'll start with you. What skills and knowledge should institutions be developing initially to ensure that they are stewards of their own digital futures?
So we're all experts in our field, right? We know the skills, we have the values to be in this field, and where we have gaps fall further outside the cultural sector than I think I really imagined. Normally I would have said technical skills. We need the technical skills. And now I think I've transitioned a little more to raising baseline literacy around organizational and governance models, around business and financial planning, and planning and strategy tools, all within the cultural sector. This might include a variety of things. Learning how to participate in a landscape analysis, particularly on behalf of a collective endeavor or part of your department, contingency and succession planning, budget scenarios and projections, being able to just make clear and data-formed business arguments to, say, your membership or to your boss or your department about why increasing fees are happening, keeping up with inflation and other increasing costs. And just generally being able to think through scenarios with a business mindset that complements our expertise in the field and the values that we have in the cultural heritage space. Most of the digital preservationists I know, most of the archivists I know, have not been in positions where they've had to develop these skills. Archivists aren't trained to think about, large-scale business modeling and financial planning. I know that I sure was not. I was the treasurer here. I've started working on budgets in our department more and more, and I'm learning as I go, flying by the seat of my pants a little bit. It's been really interesting. But I was never formally trained to think like that, to think of it as a business, to think of the financial strategy over time and not just, oh my gosh, I hope we get any kind of budget this year. So that really goes against the grain where within community governance models, these same archivists and same digital preservationists that don't quite have the skill set necessarily are in positions to inform those strategic financial decisions. There aren't really good market-based models to support public goods and services, which makes sense because there hasn't been an emphasis on those skills for digital preservationists or archivists. However, we're finding that a lot of networks and services see themselves competing for members and subscribers because we're a relatively small group of organizations, and we're faced with questions about sustainability that really can only be worked through with a more expansive skill set and competencies within that community group, including facilitation, mediation, strategic and budgetary planning skills. All of these are needed to establish and maintain long-term international collaboration.
And Zach, what are some of the components? Alex just focused on the skills and competencies of the member representatives in order to make the digital preservation network successful long-term. What are some of the components that need to be in place for a successful community-governed digital preservation network at large? So the network as a whole rather than the skills at the individual basis.
Yeah, so just thinking through my experience in MetaArchive, up to and including the sunset process, there's just a handful of components that I think are fundamental to a community-governed digital preservation network. And I've kind of divided these up there's a handful that are for members, and then a handful of components that are, for the organization itself. So for members, I think there's a real need for transparency for the members. So a clear set of expectations of what services all members are expected to receive, and saying, just digital preservation is what we provide, that's not clearly enough. So some examples could be reporting on what's in the network and what the status is of the items that are in that network, and methods for ingesting content into the network. Documentation at the very least about how you might go about doing that. Another component I would say is an understanding of the real cost associated with providing those services, and then accompanied by annual projections, as Alex was mentioning, that take into account both increased costs as well as technological trends that are changing the institutional environments. I think we all kind of saw those things happening while we were in MetaArchive, but I don't know how well articulated they were. And once those costs are defined and determined, then we can talk about how institutions might provide their resources to make in-kind contributions and things of that nature. But we really need that baseline cost calculations to even really begin that conversation in a meaningful way. And then lastly, for members, I think clear mechanisms for group learning and training, and then operationalizing those trainings, which Jackson will talk about a little bit later, I believe. From the organizational side, I think a clear governance design is also very important, specifically knowing what decisions lie with community boards or committees, and then what decisions lie with a small number of key personnel that are responsible for day-to-day operations. I think there should be a shared, documented technical roadmap, a clear set of guidelines about and then also a clear set of guidelines about how the roadmap is updated and what is prioritized. You might say a roadmap for the roadmap. Yes, a meta map. I did think about that the other day, actually. Then I think also growth targets. When we're talking about a community-based digital preservation network, we're really talking about members of the network, members of the community, members of the cooperative. And I think it's really important to have, if not annual targets, at least periodic targets where the network can kind of take stock of where we are with the membership, what are we working towards, and what are our goals. Then with the sunsetting process, I think we really saw that well-documented contingency plans and policies are very important as well. And, ideally those things are established at the beginning of the network's formation. And really the purpose of those plans are so that decisions in response to existential threats and institutional change are not emotional decisions or rushed in their implementation. I wouldn't say devoid of emotion, of course, but not purely emotional decisions or reactions. And then finally, I think there should be a shared understanding of what types of revenue best support the cost. And when I was thinking about this, I think when I say shared understanding, I think really what we're talking about are policies and written down formal policies. So the different types of revenues that that we dealt with in MetaArchive, and that I think would be pretty common across all digital preservation networks, are membership fees. And these, membership fees should be the sources of revenue that pay for all or most of the ongoing operational costs of the network. We can talk about tiered pricing and, plans for periodic percentage increases. There's also an idea of potentially anchor or sponsor members that really play a large role in resourcing the network. I know with some of the more recent private LOCKSS networks, there has been a lot of activity from state libraries, for instance. So those are membership fees, and those are really for the operational needs of the community. But then there's also grant funding. But I think we would all agree that grant funding really shouldn't be a source of ongoing operational funding. They can't really be relied to make up for ongoing institutional investment and shared critical infrastructure, both of which really need to be supported by the membership fees and membership resources. They are, however, appropriate to fund experimentation, pilots, development of new features, kind of like I was talking about with Project Mycelium before, and other activities that are term limited. But before you even think about applying for a grant, the network should really understand how any successful outcomes of the grant, say it's a technical product that comes out of the grant, how is that product going to be integrated and financially supported beyond the term of the grant? Basically, how is that going to be supported by membership fees going forward? And then finally, we have sponsorships, which are maybe even more short term and are used for things like events, publications, and other ways that the network might engage with the broader digital preservation community.
Thank you so much, Alex and Zach. So second to the last question, Snowden, Jackson, what models can we learn from in order to achieve greater resilience in community-driven digital preservation networks? So Snowden, your piece of this question, what do these models tell us about the benefits of understanding community-driven digital preservation networks as essential civic and technical infrastructure rather than technical solutions for, say, higher ed and cultural heritage institutions only?
Yeah, I think that's such a key question for everybody, right? This is essential infrastructure. And it's been intriguing for me as somebody who's new to the LOCKSS universe to be able to take a bird's eye view and see how the LOCKSS user community has been a learning community. And MetaArchive, as Vicky again set us up so beautifully for yesterday, talking about the history of LOCKSS. MetaArchive provided proof of concept of the idea that LOCKSS is like Texas Pete. You can put that on anything. Use it for not just academic and research libraries, but for smaller historical societies. Any kind of digital asset can go in there and be preserved. So as more PLNs have propagated, building on the model that MetaArchive established, we can really see them evolving in the direction of essential infrastructure and regional infrastructure. So, for instance, we have the Alabama Digital Preservation Network, which really looked at the grant-driven framework of MetaArchive and thought we want to maybe improve on that. So they had this prime the pump financial model where in the initial infusion of grant funding led into a financial structure where member fees are pooled to subsidize the necessary refresh of hardware. They are operating and have been operating at a healthy reserve for many, many years. They're self-sustaining. and the Michigan Digital Preservation Network. Hi, Scott Garrison from MCLS. Good to see you here. Michigan Digital Preservation Network further refined that model, and it was driven by a statewide survey of digital preservation practice that really identified significant need on the part of the smallest and least resource organizations, and understood that that was a state level problem to solve. And among their innovations is a collaboratively operated node where the capital area district libraries and Michigan State University, one had the space and one had the IT talent. And so the node is physically hosted in one place and remotely operated by staff from the collaborating institutions. So talking about abundance and approaching these questions as not what do we not have, but what do we have and what can we bring and who can help meet us halfway. Very collaborative and very creative as well. And the newest, or I should say most nascent network in the Loxiverse, the expanded Lox universe, is GinkgoNet, which is being launched by former MetaArchive members, Purdue, IndiePres, and the University of Louisville, and intended to serve the greater Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio, Ginkgo, area, the whole region. And they're leaning into this idea of being essential infrastructure, again, for an underserved region or for institutions that are geographically close and can collaborate effectively. They're going to be approaching an Indiana-focused foundation for startup funding they need, which might have in a previous year come from IMLS, as it has for the other networks. So the approaches that I'm talking about here, they don't deny need. They recognize need, but they balance that need with have. So who brings what to the table? Who can get you halfway there? And we're kind of Zeno's paradoxing our way to the finish line in every case, rather than saying like, we don't have it, we can't do it. It's we don't have that, but we do have this. And I think that that's an important shift in framing.
Thank you so much, Snowden. So Jackson, what lessons can be learned from mutual aid networks and other cooperative models outside of cultural institutions, digital preservation, that can inform the future of community-driven digital preservation?
So earlier in the open plenary, I think David set us up really well when he was talking about locks, and he mentioned that locks are designed to be cheap and easy to use. That in a lot of ways, because machines require human intervention, that having lots of copies on like okay quality hardware was more reliable than having a smaller single copy on really high quality hardware. But he also kind of pointed out this challenge that despite locks being free or at least cheap, sometimes there was a difficulty with the uptake for whatever reason. That even though it was cheap and anyone could do it, someone still had to do it, and less someones were doing it perhaps than expected. And I think that's something that we definitely saw with MetaArchive, with understanding that even though things are cheap, things are never really free, right? Because things that are cheap in money are usually subsidized with an increase in labor, or what we think of as sweat equity. And Locks is a good example of that. It has flexible hardware requirements, but it's human in the loop, which is both a strain and a challenge, right? You get local control. That's important as stewards of cultural heritage material, but you have to maintain adequate staffing to keep the human in that loop. And that's not something that's specific to Locks, right? I would argue that this is an inherent feature of any kind of community digital infrastructure, or even any kind of any kind of digital infrastructure in general. The system doesn't run itself, so you need to make sure that you are running it. And of course, the system never runs itself. So when you're not running it, the vendor is running it, right? Or someone is running it. And so kind of building off what Alex was talking about earlier about how, in the past, she may have said that what we need is technical skills, but really there's a much wider range of skills that you need if you want to successfully run not just a community product, but really community infrastructure. I think it's really important to be clear about what the expectations are about what skills members will need to participate meaningfully in any kind of community preservation solution, and have clear scaffolding to build up those skills. Because it's true, those aren't necessarily going to be the skills that people come into the network with. And that's not only understandable, that's in a way desirable, because as Snowden said, that's an investment. You're investing in your staff, not only to get this digital preservation solution, but to build those competencies that are going to be key for them to participate in any kind of collaborative community effort, even if it's not digital preservation specific. right? So Snowden had kind of given this example of both ADPNet and MDPN building a funding structure for the network itself to be able to help replenish software, right? So to not be dependent on the budgets of their host institutions for that. And I want to give an example from outside of the library world that is a more expansive way of thinking about how you can not only provide hardware, but also what skills can be taught to community members. So the Digital Stewards Project, run by Community Tech New York and El Puente, they provide not only hardware, but also networking fundamentals for community organizations to set up their own local servers with a vision for understanding that if there are infrastructure crises on a national level, that these organizations are already positioned to support their community with digital infrastructure as well, but they need those skills, right? And I think in libraries, it's actually a really interesting example because in libraries, we often think about how it can be really difficult to get sysadmins, or you get increasing centralization of IT. And so this is a community effort that you see where they're like, no, we can give them the hardware, you can give them a Raspberry Pi, you can give them some kind of lightweight infrastructure, but you can also teach them basic sysadmin skills, right? And so I think that thinking about that model kind of expansively would really allow a wider range of institutions, and especially smaller cultural heritage institutions, to participate more robustly in LOCKSS networks or other distributed digital preservation networks, not only as contributors of content, but storage hosts. Because I think that oftentimes, speaking to Alex's earlier point, there are pain points around technical skills, right? And that sometimes we can be limited in thinking about what technical skills can and cannot be transferred, or what needs to be outsourced. And so in this case, community digital preservation solutions not only distribute the responsibility and the labor for the work, but it's actually also actively building the necessary technical and governance skills among members, which is critical for us to maintain our own local infrastructure as well as any kind of collective infrastructure in a shared cultural heritage environment. I want to also expand our thinking about digital preservation beyond just a joint technical solution to keep stuff somewhere. That collective responsibility for digital preservation is integral because if we understand our work as contributing to a thriving knowledge commons. Driving inspiration from a parallel context, the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which envisions a seed commons to coordinate collaboration while recognizing that cultivating culturally appropriate solutions to restoring seed stewardship will look different in different communities. That digital preservation, I think, it's not only about storing materials, right? There's a reason why those materials are important, but as Alex was saying, digital preservation is a whole process with a whole set of activities. And that by participating in these kind of distributed models, you're really building the skills and knowledge amongst the members so that you're working collectively on the project digital preservation. And that you're having those skills so that in the future, if your needs no longer align, right, you're not reliant on having gotten those sources from someone who has goodwill, but maybe, people's interests change over time. That's fine. And really speaking to the diversity of cultural heritage institutions, yes, we have needs in common, but we also have holdings and needs that are different. And only really through active participation and creation can you really ensure that you'll have or you'll make what you actually need according to your own local context, because no one can really judge that for you.
Thank you so much, Snowden and Jackson. So that brings us to our final prompt for all the panelists. In a time of field and nationwide change and transition, investments in shared infrastructure and interinstitutional communities of practice create both an abundant and resilient information ecosystem. Only collectively can we guarantee access to our cultural heritage in the long term. So the last question is an invitation for each panelist to tell the audience why they specifically believe that statement to be true. So we're going to start with Alex and make our way to Snowden. Alex, go first.
When cultural heritage organizations holding collective memory, when they are threatened, we have to have a focused and community level response. Excuse me. And we are currently being threatened. I think we all agreed on that yesterday during the forum. It really validated me. Thank you for that, community. And our funding, our administrative support, our mission and vision and priorities are all being impacted as we speak. And we have to have a group effort to find those solutions that many organizations can also participate in. So lowering the barrier for participation so that we can have a real community response that is strong and as powerful as it can be. Virginia Tech works with a lot of community collections, a lot of cultural heritage community collections. And an organization that I work really closely with for the last several years was just furloughed. MLS funding completely stopped. I got the text Friday morning, bright and early, that all work stopped. And we had been planning projects with them for a long time. And about an hour and a half ago, they got a text saying that these now unpaid, very dedicated people will let me in the building. And they'll let me in the building to go pick up their material. And it's because we've managed to build trust with them through community advisory boards. It's very shocking, actually, that they trust anyone at Virginia Tech, given our history. And I say it with love. I mean, it was an interesting history. But this planned event is now, prematurely coming to us. It's going to be a lot of heavy lifting, but I know that we can do it because we have the infrastructure built around it where Virginia Tech is working with the community is working with Virginia Tech, and we have something to fall back on. And that's my own personal, localized example. But all of this is only possible through mutual trust. I trust the people I work with far more than I do a black box. We're brought together by shared missions and transparency and a shared mandate overall. I have strong feelings about that, apparently. Sorry, so we do it. We have to have these strong networks in place during these periods of time where our values and our intrinsic missions are being threatened. So yes, this statement is very true for many, many reasons, but that's my soapbox. I'll pass it to Zach.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, so I feel fortunate to work at a university that's part of a university system, California State University system. And, we're currently, the system as a whole, 23 campuses, is experiencing budget pressures, enrollment decline, and what the system's response to that has been is to really, try to work together as much as we can. How can we pool our resources? There's been an idea that's been circulated of systemness. How can we think about systemness and the things that we're doing within the libraries and within the campuses themselves. And it's been very interesting to see that kind of take place. It's still kind of in the beginning stages. I said 23 campuses just a minute ago. Well, it's going to be 22 campuses on July 1st because there's going to be some consolidation going on. But I like the way that it's going. I see a lot of potential for that model within the system, and I really think it kind of mirrors what can be done in digital preservation as well.
Thank you, Zach. Jackson?
Yeah, and I think there's kind of this interesting thread when we think about diversity within a network, where there's unique contexts, unique needs, but I really want to emphasize that there's also unique strengths. That I think that when you work together collectively, it's not just that you have more quantitatively, but I think qualitatively, even the largest, most resource institution isn't going to know everything, right? No one knows everything. And so there's a way that when you're able to pool your resources together, like you're really able to not just have the large institutions subsidize the small institutions, but really benefit from the unique knowledge that staff members at small institutions have that you might never hear about otherwise because you don't normally interact with them. And I do want to emphasize here as well that it's really powerful, but it's also a lot of work. And so it's important to kind of keep in mind that for collaboration, I think together we are stronger, but also together it takes slightly more time than individually just stacking that time. And it's actually really important when we're talking about planning and collaboration that we're realistic about that and we incorporate that into what collaboration looks like.
Right? If you want to go fast, go. If you want to go far, go with friends. We all know that one. The last session before this one I attended had the sort of immortal pronouncement, like, we're Yale, so of course we can't use a tool that Harvard built. So I think LOX isn't for everyone, and that is okay. It's also okay for things to come to an end and for us to take what we've learned and propagate that outwards, which I'm very proud to see happening with MetaArchive. It was a point of pride for us also that With all of the uncertainty surrounding the announcement of a sunsetting process, the one thing nobody worried about was the security of their data. The data was fine. That was the least of our worries. And that, to me, is a real achievement. And on the opposite side of we're Yale, we can't use what Harvard did or Stanford or whoever, we have what happens within the LOX user community, which is we're an institution that will take whatever we can get and share whatever we can spare. And frankly, I think it's going to be not cool for a lot of people to give Jeff Bezos any more money. I think the pressure to divest, especially for public institutions, is going to be very real in the near future. I think the opportunity to express institutional values in ways that don't involve placing our most precious assets in the hands of commercial third parties that have no intrinsic motivation besides money to do the work that they're contracted with, and no real loyalty to their subscribers or their members or their customers beyond their ability to pay, is really going to be receiving some pushback. So I am sad that I joined the LOX program when the sun was setting, but I'm really excited to see what the dawn of tomorrow brings.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And with that, we'll open it up for any questions from attendees. And Snowden and I, as well, on behalf of all people here organizing this conference, thank you so much, gentlemen, stand at the mic to ask your question.
Some of your questions. It's just a short little walk, y'all. You can do it.
Nathan, there we go.
Nathan was on the inside of this.
It's true.
You have some insights.
Taking the question differently, though. Nathan Tallman, AP Trust, MetaArchive fan, former participant. Running LOX nodes, right, the library has to host the infrastructure, and you talked a lot about the values of that, or why that's a beneficial part. There's a trend happening in higher education where IT is being centralized, and so library ITs are being scooped up in part of a larger enterprise IT organization. Some folks that I've talked to, deans where this is happening, some of what they're hearing about the motivation for this is that libraries are viewed as rogue IT shops that do things that they disagree with, and they want to take control. And I'm anticipating headwinds for libraries when their central IT shifts, their IT people shift to central. They're going to question running something like a Loxbox or that type of commitment. Oh, we can do this. We've got this solution for you, and it becomes a technocentric solution. What are some thoughts to combat that and to advocate for the library-owned and managed infrastructure in the face of centralization trends? Thank you.
Well, Nathan, I can say, from some of my UT colleagues, at least one of the former UT colleagues here, I was at UT during the period when that was happening. Exactly. We were doing a massive sort of ad hoc modernization program. They were bringing IT staff that had been, those ongoing trends of decentralization, centralization, decentralization, and back and forth and back and forth. We were in a period of centralization, and even just trying to get a computer that I could have in the digital archive to install like BitCurator or some Linux system to do disk imaging, etc., was highly problematic. I think it is going to take some work to explain that scalability is not the primary design principle for long-term cultural heritage. And that's an educational process. I think with enough examples, David also set us up for this yesterday, like the long tail, the tape storage. It's like, okay, that's what we're dealing in. Is the long tail. So I think that, those trends come from a particular set of principles and are optimizing for particular outcomes. Cultural heritage preservationists that are working with digital materials are optimizing for a different set of outcomes. And I think that just needs to be made more explicitly clear. But I open that question up to any of the other?
Yeah, and I'll add also, kind of building off of what I was saying about how collaboration is powerful, but it's actually really time consuming. And there's like a lot of steps that you have to do that are maybe outside of your domain. If you're someone who has deep domain knowledge in a technical area, essentially communication is hard, right? And I think that oftentimes sometimes there's disagreement between central IT and like how a library IT department would do it, but sometimes there's also just misunderstanding. And there isn't necessarily the space or the time to have those kind of more conceptual grounding or like conversations around the library's approach to how it would organize information, right? I mean, I think there is a little bit of like, there are other questions, like for example, like what can you have your library staff do versus like what do you technically need your IT staff to do? But I think that sometimes also these same collaboration questions around like how do you successfully collaborate interinstitutionally? Well, when your IT gets snatched, it becomes in effect a kind of interdepartmental collaboration, right? And that's going to be a lot more effort. And you could say maybe that's worse. Like maybe you would prefer to have your IT department in the library. But if you don't have it, like, do you have the mechanisms in place for that what is now a collaborative effort to succeed? And I think there's even this question of like, as someone who used to work at an institution that has a library IT department, like, does the library understand what value its technical, like for example, its developers are doing in a way that's different from central IT? So like, are you able to successfully make an argument against the centralization? Or even if you are not able to stop it, like, are you able to kind of articulate conceptually what the differences are, aside from the fact that it's frustrating? Because I think that when you're not able to make people understand your disagreement, it also becomes a lot more difficult to advocate for it.
There are also real security concerns associated with that centralization trend, and so I want to acknowledge those. One of the things that could be helpful in repositories on campus that are trying to maintain some of their own hardware is to request a copy of the security audit questions. I think sometimes what happens is that the security audit has to happen in order to get the approval to order the equipment. Maybe there's an equipment manager within your repository or library that's going to be responsible for providing information that's requested of central IT. But I think that would also be really helpful, and that's very actionable. What are the questions, what are the components of the audit, so that we can prepare our argument directly in conversation with the criteria that's going to have to be met by centralized IT for very good reasons. Yeah. Are we? Yeah. Yes, we're there. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We appreciated your attendance. Thank you for coming and your questions.